Welcome to Fulfillment Unpacked, the show where we bring together 3PL operators and industry leaders to share real stories, practical lessons, and strategies for running a smarter, more fulfilling warehouse. I'm your host, Scott Harward, and today I am joined by Casey Winans. He's the founder and CEO of Fullstride, a former co-founder of an 8-figure consulting firm, and a guy who helps warehouses figure out one of the toughest challenges they face, which is when and how to choose the right WMS. Welcome to the podcast, Casey.
Thanks for having me.
So to get started off on this episode, wanted to ask, what's the most funny or most outrageous reason you've ever heard of why a 3PL picked a WMS?
Oh boy. I guess outrageous, just off the cuff here, would be a small 3PL. And in this sense here, we're talking probably, when I say small there, for the rest of the story, would be someone probably in the $20 million revenue range. And they went immediately out of the gate and they went and bought something like a Blue Yonder, a mega vendor, right? So they saw the price tag, they saw the fairy tale implementation cost during the demos, and they thought that was reality, right? You get into it, sure, I could pay the subscription fees, and then everything comes off the bus. All the wheels come off the bus, right? You have the fact that you realize that, there's a bunch of questions that you're not ready to answer. And when that sets in, that means there's a whole lot more work than you thought there was early on. So right there, budget timeline out the window, costs are soaring. And then you get into the fact that the vendor isn't necessarily there to handhold you through the business maturity piece of it. So they're there, rightfully so, to make sure you can get into the software, you can access it. And then there's a big spectrum of what success looks like, but they're not there to flesh out everything you do behind the scenes. That's the huge one right there. They go right to the big vendor, and they blow past anybody else that might be more right size for them.
How did that impact the way you advise and consult companies?
I came up through working with Blue Yonder, or the various prior names and smaller companies that were merged over time. And you would see companies that were at the bottom part of their market, they would try to jump in, and then they'd have all these maturity issues and expectations that were out of line and assumptions that went unchecked, and they would flounder. And I saw that happen over and over again. And I thought, well, I like working with these folks. For one, they're more approachable. They're looking to learn. And then there's other vendors out there, like a step or two down below that are not mega vendors size, that really want more business. So I'm like, well, maybe I can connect the dots. So that's been my impetus for what I've been doing the last, call it 4 or 5 years.
Right. You said that one of the most common mistakes a 3PL makes is buying a WMS too early or the wrong one. Tell me about the moment that you realized that this was a systematic problem.
Yeah, I was about 1.5 years ago, roughly. I guess that's when I finally decided to do something about it. So if I look back and look, it was a pattern I had seen throughout my whole career. It didn't matter if I was working with big companies, medium-sized companies, or small ones, whatever kind of vendor. Really, there was no incentive to slow down and really kind of, I guess, look at the foundation of what's going on, right? There's the vendors want to sell, and most of them are very much sales focused. So they're not going to do vetting and do anything that would slow down the sale, right? There's that fear that you're going to go somewhere else. And we could talk about that for days. But then you have the other side of it where the businesses, they're close to it, right? It's really hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. So you're not aware of what you don't know. And you always have the best, picture of what your business does versus having like an honest, brutal take of it taken and then calling out where things need to be improved, right? Or there's fuzziness. Right. So that's pretty much about 1.5 years ago is when I decided to actually do something about it in earnest.
So you work with 3PL owners and operators who are in the day-to-day of their business. They see everything going on and they're worried about making sure everything goes right. Now, when it comes to technology and different features of the business, a lot of times that requires you to take your head out of the day-to-day and really start thinking about how to work on the business rather than in the business. What trends or patterns have you seen among 3PL owners in being able to do that successfully?
One of them is having the desire to do that, right? So you have this ambitious mindset of, I want it to grow beyond me, right? I have a vision for what I want to achieve, and I recognize that I can't be the center of it forever, right? I need to build out systems, build out people. So that's a big part of it. The other one is really, it's just the folks that have the mindset of looking around and I guess consuming podcasts, other material, talking to people and getting out there to find out what else is going on. a lot of the folks I do work with, they're first time owners of a business. They're much more operationally minded. So the technology piece is there, but it's always kind of, I guess, pushed down the priority, I guess, list in a way, right? Because we have fires every day we're dealing with.
Yeah.
So they're the folks that would stop and go, okay, well, I need to have someone come in and at least point me in the right direction, cut through some of the noise, and really tell me what my business looks like or where there are gaps. And those are the kinds of folks that really, I think, are well poised to make that leap.
Do you have a particular story or an example of working with one 3PL owner versus another, and how their mindset towards growth and change made the difference in being able to choose the right solution or be able to make progress in their company?
Let's go back to the fact that I wasn't working with 3PLs until, let's call it, what is this? This is now almost the 9th month, probably about 10 months ago. So, and I had a reason for it. I came out of big companies, working with big customers, and the massive 3PLs were they didn't want to listen. They just wanted to figure out how to get you to do your work for less money, right? So it's just labor.
Right.
So I had kind of like put all 3PLs in that box. And then I discovered one through a podcast I had actually guest appeared on. Referral came in, and right away, I'm like, these guys are too small, but let's go talk to them, right? So it was a perfect client. In fact, I came out of that one going, this is what I want to do. I mean, just that one client, I'm like, I want to double down here. Their story was they'd started as a merchant source. They were reselling products, digital transition, COVID kind of like really kind of tanked that business. So they moved into Amazon fulfillment, FBA. So they were a prep center and they were doing well. They were growing that. And then they realized like, well, a lot of what we're doing here is pretty close to a 3PL and some of the margins are better. So let's morph into that. Let's be a direct to consumer e-com 3PL. So about a year before they discovered me and we started talking, they had actually went out and tried to implement a WMS. One of the typical ones out there you see a lot of people using, but they almost immediately backed up from it. And intuitively, when they got in there, they realized we can't answer the questions the software requires of us because we don't know yet. Like there's something out of the mix. So they went back to their dozens of spreadsheets that manage spreadsheets, and then some other point solutions they were using for FBA prep, for getting labels. And they inched along that way for a while. And then they recognized like, okay, well, we're not going to make that transition unless we really jump into a WMS. So we need to find some help. And that's how they came to me. And I mean, immediately we were talking and they challenged me on a couple of things, right? They made my business model better in the sense that there was some concern about what's coming at the end of it, right? So more tangible results. So we worked through it. I iterated on a contract, loved it, signed it, boom, I was out there within a few days. And we just walked through the operation. We talked about what they're trying to achieve. And that one right there was awesome because it made me realize that some of the things that made sense for this kind of businesses, they were really eager to hear what I had to say. Like we're making it work, but we're probably not doing it right or the best way. So point it out, right? Even if it feels obvious. So we talked through that and I gave them a laundry list of things that were considered quick wins. And then we went through and I gave them priority things to work through, really business maturity wise in terms of getting clarity inside their business. And then 3 to 4 different vendors they could look at that point based on what I'd learned. So that one was great there. They were really paying attention to that kind of piece of it. But on the flip side, let's talk about another one that maybe didn't do that, right? So there's a lot of folks that I've bumped into since I've been talking to 3PLs and they view WMS as very tactical. It's just software. So I'm going to grab it, I'm going to throw it in and then they're comfortable. I guess, I don't know if comfortable is the right word. They make do with the fact that like we're only using 20% of it, right? They're viewing this as, can you come in and turn wrenches on some configurations so we can get more mileage out of it? And I'm more pushing back saying, let's look upstream here. What are you trying to achieve? Because if we don't know that, you can turn wrenches, if you use that kind of analogy all day long, it's not going to get you where you need to be if you don't know where you need to be. So there's a lot of that. I bump into that quite often. I've had folks that come out of the woodwork and they want to move warehouses. They want to put in some kind of advanced accounting system, and they want to put in a system, WMS all at once. And there's no talking them back from that, right? They're going to have to go through it. It's going to be miserable if they make it through it. But there's just that big, I guess, divide in terms of how people look at the technology early on. That's when you start to see where the folks that will go someplace and then other ones that just they flounder and they get stuck in a small scale, or eventually they kind of work themselves out of business, unfortunately.
Right. A lot of times in my experience, working with different executives of different companies, sometimes it's hard to choose a vision, as in where are we going? Because that greatly determines what different solutions work best for the company. And, a lot of people go for, oh, well, we just want the most flexible, most robust system. And then that way we can go in any direction. But a lot of times, in my experience, robustness comes with training. It becomes with a lot of technical nuances, especially if the tool isn't built specifically for the direction you're trying to go. And it can lead to a lot of bloat and a lot of unnecessary expense.
Yeah, for sure.
In a recent LinkedIn post that you put out, you said many 3PLs doing less than $10 million don't need a new WMS. They need help making the one that they already bought actually work. Let's dive into that a little bit. Give me a little bit more context behind that post.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the tactical nature of it, right? There's these expectations that the vendor is going to come in and they're going to put this magical system in place and it's going to solve all your problems. Reality is they start asking questions, and they can be simple questions, and your team gives several answers, which means clarity is not there. And which also means it's going to take more time to actually get the mileage out of a system that you're craving, that you need. So
Right.
it happens all the time. I think in that post, there were several vendors I called out, not because they're bad. I don't want to put that out there. It's the fact that they have a good chunk of market share, but the expectations, the assumptions around it was, if things don't work well, it must be the software. People don't necessarily, and this is just people in general, right? Our mindset, most of us
Right.
are not to look back and reflect internal and go, ooh, I made a mistake, right? It's easier to look around and blame shift. It's just human nature. But that's the reality of that post was, you've made this investment. You're not getting the mileage out of it. Let's see if we can fix that, right? Most of that comes down to, what were you trying to achieve? What do you do? And let's find those trade-offs and those constraints that we can build rules around. And then you start to get the mileage out of the system that you need. And we can keep layering on that until we get to the point where your business is humming along excellently. But also, at some point, those starter systems, you're going to outgrow those at some point. You're going to hit that ceiling and go, I need something next. And at that point, it's been virtuous right there. Like, helped you get more out of it. But at the same time, like, okay, maybe you come back and you talk to me when it comes to next systems, because I know what you're doing. I know the ceiling issues. And then I'm aware of what the next systems could be for you based on what I know of your business and where you're trying to grow. So that was the impetus there. But yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, there are so many systems. In fact, I had the other in my poll, and there were probably half a dozen different systems there that were mentioned to me in DMs once or twice each. So I mean, it's a long tail. Really, the big pattern there is, it's not really the software most of the time, right? Maybe it was too small for you. Yeah. But at the same time, the software didn't fundamentally fail. It was, you didn't have the right inputs in there to get great results out of it.
Right. As a 3PL, how do you balance the way you go about building your tech infrastructure? And by that, I mean, how do you balance buying something new and just kind of starting fresh versus duct taping the systems that you currently have? I've seen several 3PLs that it seems like they've mostly just duct taped all these different systems, and they're in urgent need of like an upgrade. But at the same time, that upgrade is going to be pretty arduous, and it's going to take a lot. And it's going to take them a lot of time to figure out how to fit their little niche needs that they'd already developed amongst themselves.
Right. Yeah. I mean, perfect way to, I guess, approach this in my mind is, there's a pace that you have to go. And I think this is probably where most advice out there that's not tailored towards those 3PLs that are, sub 10 million in revenue. It's an hourly fee, and it's expensive, and it's really just effort, and there's no real finish line necessarily, versus knowing the market and working backwards to say, okay, this is how we're going to move along. We're going to build rapport through the whole piece of it. And at the end, you're empowered to take this and run with it yourself in a way that's broken down so it makes sense, and you can bite these things off. Or if you want to go faster, or you recognize that, hey, this is a lot of work for us, let's keep going. That's fine too. But so what things really is, there's a way, most of the time when I'm dealing with like some of these early stage ones, and it seems to be more, I guess, more common than I would have thought, is there's this transition from merchant to something maybe like a prep center for FBA, or merchant to 3PL. And they have, there's the mindset and some of that, right? It's been built around spreadsheets and maybe a single purpose software that's great to get started. It has a very low ceiling. Is changing that around to say, okay, well, this is how a typical 3PL that scales up would look, right? You have very robust processes around the core pieces of the warehouse, right? Bringing and receiving. Put away now is this thing you need to pay a lot of attention to, because if you can optimize that, the inventory coming in, most of the downstream things become easier because you've made some of those decisions and you have some factual evidence of why you need to do it upstream. Enforcing that helps along. So it's talking about each of those pieces from receiving, planning, picking, shipping, all the way out, cycle counting in there, to let's bite these off in a way that makes sense, that you can jump into little by little, and we'll reframe that. And maybe we can make some mileage, or make some headway, I guess is a better word, while you're still with some of these patched together systems you've built, right? We can probably make some tweaks there to kind of get you closer to it, so it's not such a black and white difference, right? But another thing that's kind of beautiful about 3PLs is there is the ability to take a new client or a client who's ready to invest with you in a certain way, like maybe they're frustrated based on the missing pieces of the equation, right? Visibility, right? But they're willing to, okay, I'll be one of the first clients, we'll move over to it and we'll give you feedback. So it works great for us, but also you're building that foundation. So there's a number of ways to approach it that way. And then you can keep pulling in new clients. Now, the downside to that, potentially, if you have multiple clients in one location, is now you have two ways of processing things, hopefully temporary, right? You kind of prove out the model quickly, you iterate. And then now you can start pulling on the other clients in mass where, it's rinse and repeat at that point. You've built your playbooks, your SOPs, and you're ready to go. So that's how I've seen it. That's how I typically talk about it. And of course, every 3PL is a little different, right? So their appetite for risk and change and the team makeup is always a bit different, right? So that's the wild card there.
Yeah. So tell me about during this transition process of taking it piece by piece, what's the number one piece that tends to get in the way during a transition?
In my experience so far, looking at this, is the folks that come from, I guess, maybe like the prep world, right? Because a big giant chunk of what they did, what they focused on, was all the minutia around getting inventory ready to send to an Amazon fulfillment center. So they baked most of that around that piece of it. Now, and the way I like to describe it is 3PLs, proper 3PLs, they do things called value-added services. That's what FBA becomes. So now you're putting that into the context of, you have orders coming in, you have inventory from your clients, you're managing it, now you're fulfilling orders. And during that fulfillment, you have certain things that you need to do that are client specific or customer specific for their, your clients' customers. And you build SOPs around that, and you make sure you're doing it compliantly. Well, Amazon becomes one of those. Hey, if you're shipping to other big box retailers, they all have their own compliance nightmares to deal with as well. So as soon as you can get to that model, now you have nice constraints around what that looks like at that point. You can build SOPs, you have maybe dedicated workstations that deal with those constraints, and you move forward. But that's the mindset that I've seen over and over again, where folks have to kind of realign how they built their business and plug it into the 3PL format if they want to grow in the way they say they do.
Right. When is not the right time to buy a WMS, even if you're growing fast?
Oh boy. In the e-com world, I would say not during Q4, right? During peak, or maybe peak is something else for you. Who knows? But like during that period of time, you should right at the very end of it. That's when you should start, right? That way you're ready for next peak, but not like in the middle of it, distracting yourself, because that's when the wheels can come off the bus in a hurry, right?
Right. Do 3PLs often delay the process a little too late, so then they are pushing up into their peak season, even though their intended original target date of making the transition to a new WMS was months in advance? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes. In fact, I think I posted about this before. It's this concept of letting urgency dictate how you embrace technology, right? You wait too long, and now the pressure's on and you cut corners. Whether you realize it or you try to or you wanted to, that becomes the reality. And that's where you get into trouble, right? Because you're spending money, you're putting a lot of resources into this, and it may not be ready. So either you missed it and you have to basically table it while you brute force through the next peak, or you go live with something that just hurts you and you're spending crazy amounts of money on overtime, bringing in experts to kind of keep the wheels on. That way, a very expensive use of your resources. That happens all the time. I mean, across my career, it's not just 3PLs. It's not just during peak. It's usually there's some kind of external catalyst. They talked about it, they waited, then they pulled the trigger, and then they want some kind of unreasonable time frame. And vendors won't push back on you most of the time. It's usually your internal team tries to tell you that, hey, this is not feasible, or you're bringing in someone external, like a system integrator or someone like me. And I get the joy, I say that facetiously of level setting and then walking you back and then putting the fact in there of why this won't work or what kind of trade-offs would be required. And they're usually horrible, right? But like, you're adults. You tell me which way you want to go. That happens often. And I mean, like I said, it transcends everything. I've worked with massive customers. Say they're on a system and it's being sunsetted. They've known, right? These big companies, they try to tell you years in advance and people just like, blind eye, I'll just pay more for a while until suddenly the option's not there. And now they have this massive system, this massive ship that they have to turn in some kind of time frame that makes no sense. And it never ends well, right? Because the trade-offs that need to be there aren't popular, right? So they tend to be ignored, or people just push forward anyways, and blindly think they have another way of doing it, and that happens, and it happens all the time. Unfortunately, you just don't see it as much in the WMS world as you would say like an ERP. ERPs and big name companies that you hear fail or struggle, they get the limelight because they can usually tie financials to it that are 9, 10, 11 figures or something crazy like that, right? That's the unfortunate truth.
Yeah, I've definitely witnessed a lot of companies when they're making technological changes or to their systems, they start off at a good pace, then they kind of slow down due to indecision or either scope creep of wanting more and more and more and more.
Oh, yeah.
Then all of a sudden they have to trim back and back and back because now the deadline's approaching. And then next thing you know, they're launching a whole new system the week of Black Friday, or a new website the week of Black Friday, or like I've seen it way too many times where new product launches, new technological system implementations occur right before the deadline, but then there's no forgiveness if something goes wrong.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's so much harder to get a customer to come back than it is to get them to buy the first time if you've really screwed them over, right? And that negative word of mouth, those feelings. And so, yeah, it's a horrible time to do it, but it happens.
So along that line, what's the most expensive WMS mistake you've seen a 3PL make?
This happened years ago, really, with me, where it was more of a traditional 3PL, pallets in, cases and pallets out. They were relatively small in terms of revenue, and they would buy the massive system. So they came in, they were able to cough up the money for the subscription on a yearly basis. They thought they understood the operational needs of it, the support structure of it, but quickly realized that they needed external help because it was monstrous. And it actually kind of leads me back to another story I can kind of pile on here is you have the smaller guys that are like, yeah, I want to get the big mega vendor because I want to do this once. Well, the analogy I use often is let's say SAP, right? ERP world, they're the biggest one out there. They're made for massive companies. So the way they've structured their software is you have a team doing one thing, right? So everyone has a part of their role is like a fractional piece of this hat. And that's how the software is built. Then you have the small businesses there where you might have one person who's wearing multiple hats, right? Not just a tiny little piece of one, but many. And then they get into this big system designed for someone doing some small part of their workflow. So there's all these jump off points. So suddenly they went from something that kind of worked for them. It was manual, there was errors, but it was built around their workflow to suddenly I have to jump through a million different screens back and forth to get one thing done. And they didn't recognize it early on, or they saw it in a demo and they just kind of like glossed over it, didn't realize. Well, that happens a lot with the mega vendor, WMS, same concept. Huge teams on the floor, right? Massive surface area for the system. You have people that are executive, people that are leadership in offices. You have the floor workers, maybe you have some automation, but it's essentially built to deal with all those different folks interacting with it versus a system that's more right-sized for, say, a small 3PL getting their first system is it's built around ease of use where it's recognized that, hey, you're wearing a bunch of hats. We're not going to give you a million screens so you can do one little piece of something with all these crazy approvals and back and forth. You're going to be able to get your work done in and out in a way that you can teach others to very quickly. So that's the big difference I see often enough in that realm. And that's the mistake a lot of folks make, especially way back when I'd heard it called out to me multiple times. Well, we had to get a blue or Red Prairie was the name of it back several years ago, or we had to get a Manhattan or a high jump because our customers were demanding it. But maybe so years and years ago. But that came with so much overhead for those folks, right? It passed on the expense and the complexity to the customers. And if they're big, they can absorb it, but it pushed out some of the smaller ones because the pricing was just atrocious, right? So
Right.
that was a big disconnect there overall.
Right. There's a lot of options nowadays for 3PLs.
Hundreds of WMSs out there. We could go for days talking about how many are realistic, right? There's a lot of them out there that came out. They have a couple customers. They haven't really updated their software in 20 years, but they're still a vendor. And there's the new ones that are coming on the scene that I think are going to upend it at some point. So yeah, there's a large spectrum, a huge gamut of different players out there.
Right. Because there's so many options, what's your number one piece of advice of getting started during the WMS selection process? How can a smaller or medium-sized 3PL find the right WMS for them?
You're looking for someone who is easy to start with, especially if this is your first system, something that's easy to start with that you think will give you some mileage for a time, right? It's not going to be the be it end all system for you if you're growing. If your goal is to be, tens of millions, you're going to hit a ceiling maybe quicker than others. So just understanding that reality, but you're looking for some that touch on the pieces that make a lot of sense for you. 3PL specific, maybe that's a possibility. Now you could go back and forth on that one. There are some out there that are 3PL specific today that are fairly rigid, right? They just have like an opinionated way of looking at the world, which is great. I like opinionated software as long as it's relevant now, right? Our industry has been changing so much that are they behind the times? It's something that should be easy, very hard on their platform. Do you have to install it? And in my opinion, you shouldn't have to install it and have servers on your side or host it. Hosted is like one step closer to cloud. But in my opinion, cloud should be the way you're doing things, right? So they have to focus on uptime. They can scale to many clients, keep it cheaper for you that way. But then they have to reinforce and talk with integration and APIs, which is the way forward. There's a lot of vendors out there that seem to want to sell to everybody. I would say caution you there, because if they're trying to talk to everybody, it means they're generalists. It means that they're not going to be great at any specific thing you do. And usually 3PLs, your functionality that's important to you is bolted on. So it's an afterthought, which means there are limitations and frustrations galore in there.
So if a 3PL founder gave you $250,000 and said, fix my warehouse, what's the very first thing you'd do?
First thing I would do is I would come in and talk to the teams and find where there are processes that should be standardized that are all over the place. Everyone has their own flavor, and get them talking to figure out what that is. And then almost at the same time, talking to different teams of what helps them and what hurts them, and get past that. So it's not even software at this point. It's much more about the business itself. How effective and efficient are you right now? Because software will either help or hurt that if you don't have it. So, and that's where a lot of the conceptual guardrails come from, is you have one team that, like, if I don't get this from this other team, my day's shot. So like, okay, well, let's air that. Let's talk about that other team. Are you aware of this? And let's find some constraints that work for everybody. And we rinse and repeat through that. The other part of it, really, the reality of it, since I've been working with clients, is looking how they put the operation together in general. Will this scale up? Or is it tied to your old merchant days where there's some inefficiencies there? Or were you a prep center and you've built your whole business around this one workflow? Well, we need to reframe that, like I talked about earlier, and make sure that it fits in the constraint that it should fit in. And now you're paying attention to all the rest of the inventory lifecycle pieces of it. And that way you bring on your next client and they just fit this new world, this new pattern. And then you come in and we start looking at systems. What makes sense, right? From where you are right now, the complexity and the workflows you have, the mix of clients you have, and where you want to go. Because where you want to go is going to be a huge driver in what system we look at. Because there might be multiple that would fit your world today. But if you want to drastically change in the next 18 months, we need to factor that in, because it wouldn't make sense to buy now, implement, and rip and replace 18 months later. We want to get 2 to 3 years out of it easily. Those are some of the big factors right there. And then the other piece is, if with that kind of budget, and if we're just like, fairy tale, is what's your warehouse space look like? Are we in a physical location that makes sense for where you want to go? It's very easy to start out in a very small space and you make do with one dock door and weird layouts and, some racking, but not necessarily optimized. Maybe we get in there and we start looking at how you're storing inventory so you can get more density and go from there, right? So make the most use of where you're at, but also go, okay, well, we know we're going to outgrow this. What's the next one look like? Are we going to double it, triple it? Yeah, it all comes down to those goals and how well financed you are.
So if I were to summarize, first you take a look at the team and understand the processes, and then make sure that you have your SOPs dialed in, because either your softwares or systems are either going to serve or hinder those processes. I think that's a key insight for a lot of people, because a lot of people tend to treat software as the process, but the reality is the software is what helps you achieve the process.
Oh yeah.
I kind of think of it like with AI. A lot of people have had to learn that, the better your prompt, the better thought through you are in your request to AI, the better the response you get. Or like from a systematic perspective, there's a lot of different types of AI out there. If you're only familiar with the generative AI, you're missing out on a whole bunch. And in the 3PL industry or in logistics, there's all sorts of use for AI, but they're very hyper process specific that can then either enhance your business a ton or waste a lot of time, depending on how well defined your processes and your needs are.
Right. Oh yeah, massively.
Moving into the consulting side of things, consulting forces you into the messes that others have created. What's the nastiest warehouse problem you've ever walked into, and how did you triage it?
Let me talk about a project I was on that was nasty. This wasn't a 3PL. This was a bigger company. In fact, it was 1 million square foot distribution center, 8 miles of conveyor, tons of, I wouldn't say robotic automation, but you had the typical conveyors back and forth, multiple level mezzanines. And they had spent 15 plus years dialing it in on this old technology, and it was being sunset. So they were forced to upgrade and look around. So they went with the vendor that bought that old software and using their new platform, which is what I knew, and helping them translate that. And there were just so many crazy trade-offs that we had to make to basically shoehorn this new system into their physical constraints. And I'll give you some examples. Their conveyor system was well over 20 years old, so way past its prime. But where they were at, they saw it as it was cheaper to maintain it by having 2 people full time in there tweaking it every day than it was to replace it, rip and replace. So that came with some other issues because all the signaling divert sensors throughout it were faulty. Or not faulty, but they missed messages, they missed signals, they would send weird things that were misinterpreted. And then the software that we built to work around that was to divert to like 26 to 30 different lanes. The fun part there is after we had spent so much time building all these customizations to deal with what they were doing, essentially not unlike trying to take packaged software and then replacing homegrown and then making the packaged software behave like this homegrown software, which is never a good thing because that's so costly to maintain. You just basically like brought all your baggage forward. We had to work through all those different divert messages that were failing in it. They went sideways. Basically, the expense of this upgrade, this uplift, this reimplementation was so much bigger than they wanted to acknowledge. The original quote would have been fairly accurate, within 20%, but they chopped it in half because they didn't want to believe reality. Well, eventually they had to approve all these overages to get there. So during the weekends, they did these mock go lives and they're like, thumbs up, it's working great, working great. We get the go live and things go sideways. We start looking around trying to figure out how it possibly could, because like, you've tested this. And we started getting access to the data and realizing that, oh, you did the same things over and over and over again. People had the same test scenarios. I'm like, of course, you optimized for those. Indirectly, you didn't realize it, but you did. Those worked great. But guess what? They all had great data that you'd fixed. You got the reality, you got in here, you realized that your data across the system was terrible. So cartonization issues, things didn't fit. Some different data when it came to different lanes wasn't there, or some of the diverters didn't work like they were supposed to. And they had old software had error correction in it that they didn't realize. So we had to like build that on the fly. So that was a massive one. I learned a ton there. Not the way I'd want to learn it, but those are some of the best moments.
And so one of the key takeaways from this is if you're going to be building a system, you have to make sure that you're building in room to be able to do it correctly. Make sure that your tests are actually true tests based on raw data, not sample test data that's already been cleaned and fixed. And then third is the communication aspect. If a 3PL were to introduce a new system without communicating to their clients ahead of time, it could cause a lot of issues if something were to go wrong, versus if they take precautionary measures and they alert their customers. And I love the idea of the ordering ahead of time, or because that provided some grace. Now it's a little bit harder for a 3PL to do in terms of the influxes of orders from buyers, but it does represent a key opportunity during these transitions is to make sure the communication is out there, so then you can catch things very quickly and make things right.
Yeah, that's the big part, right? Communication everywhere in life. If we talked a little more, we'd be so much better for it.
Let's jump a little bit ahead into some current trends. What's a tech trend that is completely overhyped right now? And what's under the radar that's about to matter to 3PLs?
Okay. So the first one I would have to say, generally speaking, the vibe coding thing with AI, where everybody can be a programmer or engineer, it can work in certain scenarios, especially if you're just doing something small, single purpose, like a gap, fixing something that you can do something and it'll be done over and over again, depending on how you structure it. So there's some upside to it, but then there's the sense of, well, we don't need engineers anymore. We can build anything. And now I think we're going to get this like over indexing of we're going to build our own software. You don't know if you're getting good or bad results from these AI platforms. And it might work now, but you don't know what it looks like behind the scenes. It might be something that looks like spaghetti where it's unmaintainable long-term, right? There's no real structure to it. It worked now, but there's no forethought into how it's going to be maintained and evolved over time. That's the part where I see so much hype right now. And I'm like, okay, look, we're going to see the fallout of that soon enough where people pinning themselves into a corner. And now it's so much harder to get out of it or course correct. So that's one trend I think is overhyped. The thing that's going to be important very soon, and I'm seeing the early signs of it in a lot of ways, is ease of implementation, ease of use. For so long, most of the vendors out there hid behind consulting, professional services, because there's a lot of complexity. I mean, if you go back 20, 30 years ago, it was so much different, right? You had to install these big monolith systems. You needed databases, you need all this other infrastructure to go along with it that would scale up and down. And you had to build out and spend for those theoretical peaks. And in order to do that well, you needed professional help external to your business in some way.
So when you moved into this industry, what was one of the things that inspired you about 3PLs in general?
It goes back to that first one I worked with, right? I almost wrote them off. I'm like, you're too small. And then, 3PLs in general of, you're opinionated, you don't want to spend money, you don't want to listen to advice, you just want someone to do. And that was not the case, right? I got to impact the business model. I could talk about anything inside the business and it was well received. And then we could talk about where they wanted to go. And that dovetailed into my system experience. So I could help them figure out what right size meant. And that was the big thing right there. Once I got to do that and married up the fact that I'm a business geek, right? This isn't my first business and I've been chewing on this stuff for a long time. I could talk for days about business models and geeky stuff like that. But at the same time, I love WMS. I love that process. I love being on the floor, finding ways to be effective and then driving efficiencies from there. So I'm like, wow, this lets me marry up both worlds. This is where I want to be. I think I could have the biggest impact this way.
What's one opinion that you have about warehouse tech that would cause a fight at a conference?
Beware of vendors in general. And that's not to like say they're evil. It's their motivations are different than yours, and what they're trying to achieve aren't exactly what you're trying to achieve as a buyer. There's this misconception of they will build a system around your business, when in reality is they're a software company. They will give you access to the software, which keyword access, and then they will help you configure it so you can get some use out of it. Doesn't mean it's going to be effective. Doesn't mean it's going to be ideal. It just means that if you pay them, whatever that onboarding looks like, they will meet those requirements. And that's usually where the scope of work is very fuzzy because of that, because they didn't spend time doing, vetting the assumptions up front. And yet on the flip side, the buyer is expecting them to be the expert in their business to move them forward, when in reality, they're software folks and they're also chasing many industries. So they're never going to be as in-depth knowledge-wise as you are about your business. They just know the software better, which hard to say isn't the same thing at all, not even close.
Right. Yeah, 3P owners and operators need to make sure that they're in tune with their business and then trust their gut in making these decisions,
right, and
while doing the research.
Yeah, they have the right to be suspicious that way and, guard their money wisely. Because if you're not getting, if no one's willing to give you concrete outcomes in a way, then you should step back, because that means there's a part of the problem or part of the step that's been missed. And that's understanding the scope and what the outcome should look like. And those things are what most salespeople run from because it's fuzzy.
So to wrap up, one last question. When you walk away from this industry and you move on either to a new industry or you retire, what's one thing that you want people to remember about you and your work?
For one, I like to help people. I mean, I guess I'm more mission-based than I am anything else this time around. My first business, not so much. I was probably a mercenary early on, right? I was younger. I was trying to make money, but it wasn't fulfilling. This time around, what I'm doing now and what I'll probably be doing next, because I have some other pursuits I'm looking at around this to capitalize on what I know and the folks I've met over the last few years, is I'm here to help.
Thanks for listening to Fulfillment Unpacked. Every episode, we're all about bringing together 3PL operators and industry leaders to share real stories, practical lessons, and strategies that help run a smarter, more fulfilling warehouse. Keep learning, keep growing, and we'll see you next time.